Welcome back to the Siegfried Wagener show, read by Todd Rubik, Omegacube. We're here in the Rocky Mountains on Siegfried's property, and we're reading Friday, February 13th, 1942's shortwave radio show to the world. Siegfried Wagener, Analysis of Propaganda. Good evening. For nearly a year, the shortwave transmissions from England have been humming and buzzing with reports of devastating aerial attacks on the Nazi battle wagons, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. In all, the British radio counted up to 110 bombings, and after listening to each of these BBC reports, the listeners could easily have been under the impression that not a shred of the German warships had been left afloat. What caught my suspicion was that the RAF continued the bombing raids in spite of all the claimed successes, and yesterday, in stormy weather, but in broad daylight nevertheless, these ships in the company of the cruiser Prinz Eugen got away. They were apparently unharmed by the 110 bombings. This is a good case to show why a propaganda analyst like myself will sometimes not touch upon frontline reports even if they seem very significant at the moment. A certain shading in the report, a slightly crude detail, and often all that causes the analyst to harbor a lingering doubt. You might say that he acts on the merest hunch, but it is more than that. Experience has shown that propaganda by shortwave or by any other means of communication remains ineffective if it is not backed up to a certain extent by facts. Sometimes facts are lacking, but the people for whom the propaganda is broadcast need, for one reason or another, something to pep them up. Then facts are made up, not lies, because that would be too dangerous. In the case of lies would be revealed, but by overemphasizing certain apparently successful happenings on the battlefront. Knowing this and its limitations, propaganda analysis will refrain from saying much if anything about such items as the bombing of the German warships in Brest, until items are verified beyond a shadow of a doubt or disqualified. As to the facts which decide success or failure of propaganda, they seem to be, for the moment, all in favor of the Axis. If Singapore should fail, and as long as our own fighting forces do not gain noteworthy success in the far Near East, Hitler's propaganda machine will be winning hands down with the German people. Until his setbacks in Russia, he kept them on a leash with the sheer endless striking of victories, which are the best propaganda for the home front. With his retreat from Moscow, the signs accumulated that without victories, German morale deteriorated fast. And as I had foreseen since the start of the war, until December 7th, the prospect was fair that the comeback of the Red Army would rip the fabric of the German nation from top to bottom, and that a revolution in Germany before the spring was not altogether impossible. Today, however, the London radio and its transmissions to a German army has to explain what is happening in Singapore in a face-saving manner. Nazi radio pounds its civilians and soldiers day and night with Jap victories, the sinking of American ships by Nazi submarines, and how vastly superior the British fleet got fooled by the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Can't say German words very good, but I'm working on it. If it was the policy of the United Nations to drive a wedge between the Nazi government and the German people, this would hardly be the opportune time unless shortwave stations of Russia, Great Britain, and the United States would combine to pound the German people with concrete proposition in spite of the Atlantic Charter, and has so far not been forthcoming. If Singapore should fall, the Axis radio's eternal repetition that Great Britain was too weak in the Far East and the Churchill cabinet could never win on any front and would finally have to succumb to the wrath of the British people, would gain all the more credit and respectability. Thus, not only the battlefields, but also in the field of shortwave propaganda, the war has reached a critical juncture. The British people are today critical of their government and of even Mr. Churchill. Not only Mr. Ha of Zen and other Nazi shortwave speakers say so, our own correspondents and even the BBC give indications of it. Dr. Goebbels considers it the right moment to have one of his broad blasters ask British listeners meekly, "Let me ask you this simple question to those of you over the age of 35. When you look back at 1917, did you think that all Germans were Huns and barbarians? Did you think in 1927 that we were all scoundrels? This soft suggestion of the Germans being humans, after all, is in line with the general Nazi propaganda technique, which always tries to prepare a way for the understanding, regardless of previous treacheries. When Hitler gives up chewing his carpets and believes that things are looking up, nothing would suit him better than that now. When events abroad and at home take a turn against Mr. Churchill, his own propaganda would help to deepen the rift between the British people and the Churchill cabinet. Sounds like Obama and us. For years, as hirelings at the microphones in Berlin have been telling English listeners that the alleged tendencies of the British government towards social reforms were just bunk, and nothing but a false front for the Tories. British Broadcasting Corporation countered these attacks in an array of speakers' rights from the ranks of the Labour Party and the Socialists. It is hardly conceivable that men like Attlee, Bevan, Priestley, and many others of the same standing and reputation would tell the world, and not only Great Britain, of a movement which is essentially non-existent. At the MBS KFEL listening post, I have been watching a constant swing to the left in British propaganda. Swing to the left. Kind of like in America. Whether the talks were given by what you might call the brass hats of the Imperial Army or by social research workers like Mr. Silverman night before last. When Army men begin to realize the social changes brought on by this war, and when they start to ponder the social consequences of these changes after the war, you can be sure that a social revolution is underway in Great Britain and in America right now. Conservatives versus socialism. They're trying to undermine everything that is American to make us one world. Confirmation of this also comes from an entirely different quarter. The Russian radio. Radio Center Moscow likes to talk at length about various committees of laborites and working men which are visiting back and forth between Russia and England since Winston Churchill announced last summer that Britain would fight side by side with the Red Army. Moscow shows a mild enthusiasm about the reception of British workers and gave Nikolai Shevchenko, the secretary of the Russian Central Council of Trade Unions, whenever he and his 13 committee members went in the shops and factories of England, they were, so says Moscow Radio, cheered by British workers. So back in World War II, when England joined with Russia to fight against Germany, it seems like that was the beginning of what's happening now in America. During the siege of Moscow, any number of telegrams expressed the good wishes of the British individuals and groups. From highbrow writers to firemen associations, Moscow Radio never failed to read every one of these over the air and to express the deep satisfaction that it was felt by all Muscovites, from Stalin on down. Likewise, Moscow Radio seldom misses a chance to announce what Russian men, women, unions, culture clubs write or wired to their comrades in England, and what they think about the British people and institutions. All of this may have been instigated by the Russian-British commander-in-arms, but it is a far cry from the treatment which Radio Center Moscow gives to the American people and their institutions. Knowing our people's antagonism to communistic doctrines, the heresy shown by the Russian propaganda towards us is rather casual, especially when compared with that which is shown by the British people, shown to the British people. It is increasingly leaning towards Great Britain, which is in sharp contrast to Russia's former propaganda attacks on everything British, is undoubtedly the repercussion to Britain's growing trends in the direction of socialism, which Moscow may not regard as a stepping stone to all-out communism, but rather as an approach to a better understanding between the British and Russian people about those social problems which loom larger and larger on the European horizon, the more Europe's war-torn and weary people think of what is to happen to them after the war is over. Add to these indications the recent resignation of Archbishop of Canterbury, who is considered one of the greatest stumbling blocks in Britain's social reforms, And coming to the fore, Sir Stafford Cripps, former ambassador to Russia and probably Russia's best friend in Great Britain. And the conclusion is inescapable that the Nazi propaganda talk is just that, when it maintains that socialism in England is only a Tory smokescreen. What Nazi broad blasts to England may have helped to bring about is exactly the opposite of what was intended. By constantly talking about the social issues in Great Britain and by unendingly claiming that nobody really meant to meet them, Dr. Goebbels' wise guys forced British listeners to think more about them than they probably wanted, and to do more about them than the easygoing British temperament was originally inclined, like lighting the fire. Thus, this type of Nazi propaganda, as all else, may prove in the end a boomerang. Smartly gotten up and cleverly infiltrated, its purpose was to disunite the British people, to set class against class, and to drive them into social disintegration and possibly revolution. Instead, it united army officer and social worker, aristocrat and working man, all of whom know today that not by fighting each other, but by solely through cooperation can they survive the war and win the peace. It is an old story that if you listen to the devil long enough, you may catch a good idea simply by getting mad at him. And that is my analysis of propaganda for the president. The shortwave stations I've referred to were London, GSF, GSC, GSL, Berlin, DJB, DXJ, Moscow, RV, and RV96. Good night. So that's February 13th.